Well, welcome to a review of the principles of documentation. I'm Becky Hall, long-term care instructor for the training unit with the Bureau of Health Provider Standards. And so welcome to this program, and this is going to be a review. Most of you have been exposed and have read and studied the principles of documentation, so let's just consider this as a refresher course, and hopefully we'll learn a lot from this presentation, and thank you for taking time to be with me today. All right, well, let's think about why understanding and implementing the principles of documentation are important. The 2567 is the final product of the survey process. And what is the impact and the importance of the 2567? Well, our main goals as a survey agency are to improve quality of care, quality of life, and ensure a safe environment in long-term care facilities. And we're advocates for the residents. So when we write deficiencies, we help fulfill those goals. We want facilities to correct deficient practices and improve care and life. When our deficiencies are written clearly, concisely, and descriptive, it leads facilities to write and implement a plan of correction. Our deficiencies also communicate to residents, family members, CMS, and other agencies and parties the status of the facility. How's this facility doing? What are their deficient practices? So think about the survey process and think about how and when we implement principles of documentation. Well, I was thinking about the survey process, and really in the initial pool process, you're documenting observations, you're documenting interviews, and you're doing a limited record review. But while you're doing those, keep the principles in mind as you're writing. When we do investigations and you're answering the critical elements, the CEs, as yes or NA or no, what have you got to have? You've got to have supporting documentation of the non-compliance. And we think about facility task. And we think about preparation for potential deficiencies. And the long-term care survey process procedures say document the deficient practice statement, the universe or the notes for the exit conference in the opening statement field. So let's get started. So we have some objectives, and so what we're going to do is talk about the principles, and you're going to be given some exercises to implement the principles, and then we're going to talk about more about how we can better use the principles of documentation. And you have a packet of materials that you will be using during this presentation. All right, so the first one is an activity 1, principles of documentation. So you have a copy of 10 questions that are multiple choice. So what I want you to do is pause. You have a copy of this. So pause the video and go ahead and complete this quiz of 10 questions. Circle the best response. All right, well, let's take a look then at the correct responses. Number 1, the correct response is C. Consists of an explicit statement that the entity is in compliance for that particular survey. Question number 2, the correct response is C. The nurse left a resident in a wheelchair by an oxygen refilling area. Question 3. The correct response is D, all of the above. A regulatory reference, a statement of deficient practice, and relevant findings and evidence. Question 4, the correct response is D, the name and version number of any CMS approved software used to generate the deficiency citation. Question 5, the correct response is B, include the facility's plan of action for correcting any deficiencies cited. Question 6. The correct response is B. A determination of not met must be documented on the CMS 2567. Question 7. All right, the correct response is D. Replace or supersede the law or regulation and therefore may not be used as a basis for the citation. Question number 8. The correct response is C. Violations of state and local laws and codes must be documented if the language of the federal regulation explicitly requires such compliance. Question 9. The correct response is D. The linked citations have a direct cause and effect relationship to the deficient practices described in both citations. Question 10. The correct response is C. Specifies the results that must be obtained or events that must occur following an act. All right, if you missed any of these, go back to that principle and make sure that you have an understanding of what was asked in that question. We look and see that a survey is a legal procedure. The 2567, the Statement of Deficiencies, is usually the primary piece of evidence in any subsequent appeal of a survey. So the findings are official, so that's why it needs to be consistent and accurate. So the Principles of Documentation gives guidance on structuring statements on the 2567. It's critical to a quality survey product. It gives clear information about deficient practices. And the deficiencies are, again, complete, accurate, concise, and specific. All right, our next part of the presentation is that we're going to look at each principle. Again, this is just a review. Your Principles of Documentation has a lot of examples, and so I would refer you to the actual CMS principles to look for additional information about them. But let's go through each one and make sure we have an overview and understanding of what that principle is all about. All right, principle number 1, entity compliance and non-compliance. You know, sometimes we do some surveys and there are no deficiencies. So when an entity complies with the requirements applicable to the survey conducted, the CMS 2567 should consist of an explicit statement that the entity is in compliance. If the entity does not comply with one or more applicable requirements, the Form CMS 2567 includes the corresponding citations of non-compliance. Principle number 2 is using plain language. And again, and I'm going to repeat some things in this presentation, and mainly I've learned over the years that's a good thing. That sometimes information is a little bit repetitive, but you know, that helps us remember it. But efficiency citation is written clearly, objectively, in a manner that is easily understood. So it's good for us to describe, but we need to be objective. And I've thought about this little story a long time ago. But you think about a man, his father and the son, and they're out fishing. And the little boy says, "Daddy, I caught a fish." And the daddy said, "Son, how big was it?" And so the son says, "Daddy, it was this big," and talking about having a huge fish. And the daddy said, "Really, son? Is it that big?" And the son said, "No, Daddy, it was just a little fish." And so when we're documenting, just making sure that we're very objective and carefully using descriptors to make sure that everything is as accurate as possible. Making sure that a deficiency citation does not ever include consultation. We never give advice. We don't give comments. We don't give directions at the survey entity when we're doing a survey. We just give the facts. That's what's important. All right, Principle 3, components of a deficiency citation. And I'm going to probably repeat this several times, but a deficiency consists of the following: a regulatory reference, of course. And the main thing is evidence, a deficient practice statement, relevant findings, facts and findings to support the finding of noncompliance. So I want you to think about these two questions as we go through the presentation. I'll come back to them. How do you get that evidence? What do we do? What tools do you use to get the evidence? So sometimes I can remember I've surveyed for many years and been involved with CMS with the basic long-term care course and Auburn University. But, you know, sometimes when you walk into a facility, you just get that gut feeling that something's wrong. And that has happened to me several times in a survey process. It just doesn't feel right. Well, unfortunately, we don't have an F tag that says, it just felt wrong. Or the fact is, it's just my guts bother me. I know something's not right here. What do we have to have? We've got to have the evidence to prove that that deficiency is there. And so we look at the what is involved in the references. And so the regulatory reference includes the alpha prefix and survey data tag number. So just think about currently F880. If we wrote that, it's going to come up with infection prevention and control. And it's going to come up with the Code of Federal Regulations, the CFR reference with the Code of Federal Register 43.80 A, 1, 2, 4, E, and F. And so it's also going to have the language from that reference that specifies the aspects of the requirements in which the entity has failed to comply. So it's going to say the facility must establish and maintain an infection prevention and control program designed to provide a safe, sanitary, and comfortable environment. And it will also have an explicit statement that the requirement was not met. So pretty much on the left on a 2567, you have the F tag. Then you're going to have the SS, the severity and scope, equals a letter. You're going to have that CFR reference. It's going to have the regulation, and so Aspen does that for us. And then it's going to say the requirement is not met as evidenced by. And then we start writing our evidence. A deficient practice statement is very important. So it's going to tell the provider and anyone who is interested in this 2567 the specific actions, errors, lack of action, the deficient practice that led to the deficiency. If we have an outcome that we can say relative to the deficient practice when possible. So what happened because of that deficient practice? We're going to have a description of the extent of the deficient practice or the number of deficient cases relative to the number of such cases, the identifier of the individuals or the situation referenced in the extent of the deficient practice, and the sources of the information from which the evidence was obtained. I'm probably going to repeat these a couple of times. And in the next part, again, and then we've got relevant facts and findings. And so these are the questions that we have always said that we need to find out. The who, the what, the where, the when, the how. And so this is going to illustrate that noncompliance and why this particular regulation is not met. Sometimes, in the principle number 4, relevance of on-site correction of findings. Have you ever been on a survey and you were documenting and all of a sudden you believe that you have a deficiency and the nursing home corrects it? So what happens to that? Well, during a survey process, even though the nursing home corrected it while you were there, then we still have to have a deficiency citation. So a determination of not met must be documented on the form 2567. The entity may include in its correction on the right-hand column of the form 2567 that they corrected it during the survey process and how they corrected it. But it still has to be a citation, even if the nursing home corrected it while we were there. It's a little bit different though if it's an immediate jeopardy situation, and while you're there, the facility takes corrective actions, and which we hope they are doing. They're taking corrective actions that abate maybe a finding about the immediate jeopardy, but that still has to be cited. And then definitely if you're in immediate jeopardy, you would seek guidance in Appendix Q. There are going to be some other situations where it may be a system failure. And so if an entity demonstrates practices that cause it to be out of compliance, it may be a system failure. The findings used as part of the evidence illustrate the result of that failure. The findings are not the cause of it. So again, if the facility does correct maybe some of those findings that were reported prior to the exit, we would definitely would not necessarily assure that the cause of the finding had been addressed. So even though they did correct something about it, they haven't looked at what was the big cause. And that's what happens in a system failure. There's something that created this situation, and they may have corrected part of it, but they haven't really assessed and determined what caused it. So the entity, not the survey team, must ascertain the cause and correct the system's failure that caused the deficient entity practice. Our next principle, number 5, is interpretive guidelines. And I love interpretive guidelines, but what this says is a deficiency citation explains how the entity fails to comply with the regulatory requirements, not how it fails to comply with guidelines for interpretation of those requirements. So why do we have guidelines? Well, they came about to assist surveyors to have a better understanding. They've gotten longer and longer, so you have some big tutorials in some of our F tags that give you lots of information. But what we have to do is we have to look at the requirements in a consistent manner, and so we're looking at these to help us understand, but the facility still has to be what? They have to be in compliance with the regulatory requirement, not the guidelines. So if you will, let's look at some interpretive guidelines. And what I did is I pulled F686. So if you pull that up, 686, you can see that this is about pressure ulcers. And in the interpretive guidelines, some areas that I think are extremely important for us, for one thing, is the intent of that requirement. And it gives you the intent of this requirement is the resident does not develop pressure ulcers injuries unless clinically unavoidable, and the facility provides care and services consistent with professional standards of practice too. And it gives us some information about the intent. And also in the interpretive guidelines, you'll see right below there a note. And in interpretive guidelines, always pay attention to the note. CMS is going to give you some clarification about that regulation in these notes. So be careful of those. So look out for those. And if you'll keep turning, it was going to give us some guidance on staging, and it's also going to give us some more notes. And in these interpretive guidelines, and I just have picked out a few things, it references the investigative protocol, but I want you to look at key elements of non-compliance. And to cite deficient practice at F686, the surveyor's investigation will generally show that the facility failed to do one or more of the following. So if you're having some trouble in coming up with what did the facility do wrong, what did they fail to do, look for these key elements of non-compliance. This says provide preventative care consistent with professional standards of practice, to residents who may be at risk for development of pressure injuries, or provide treatment consistent with professional standards of practice to an existing pressure injury, or ensure that a resident did not develop an avoidable pressure ulcer or pressure injury. And again, there's another note. To cite F686, it is not necessary to prove that the pressure ulcer pressure injury developed. F686 can be cited when it's been determined that the provider failed to implement interventions to prevent the development of a pressure ulcer or pressure injury for a resident identified at risk. The next part is so helpful because then during your survey process, you've got to determine how severe something is. So deficiency categorization gives you examples of severity level, and it's usually 4, 3, and 2. So if some of you were probably in my SOM class, and we went over these, but it gives examples of starting out with pressure ulcers, severity level 4 noncompliance, immediate jeopardy to resident health or safety, include but are not limited to. So when you're surveying and you're not sure about what is the severity level, go to this area in the guidelines, and it will help you determine maybe what is that. Because you'll find some interesting situations as to how CMS determines severity. So don't forget about referencing your SOM. It's got a wealth of information that will help us in determining and be accurate and correct as we are making decisions about what happens. All right. Use the information in guidelines, but be cautious in their use. So make sure you're not moving a guideline into the requirement. So just be careful about that. Guidelines do not replace or supersede the law or regulation and may not be used as a basis for the citation. So again, be careful. Guidelines do contain authoritative interpretations and clarifications of statutory and regulatory requirements. Yes, it gives us a lot of information of clarity, definitions, and a lot of information, but just make sure your basis of the deficiency is on the regulation itself. Also, we can look at professionally recognized standards that assist us in making determinations about compliance. If you have found that it violates a requirement because of a connection to professionally recognized standard, then we have to indicate that on the CMS 2567. So if you're looking at standard practice, you may also have an additional F tag, but make sure you have that reference for that. So carefully consider how the practices of the entity relate to the illustrations within the interpretive guidelines. Then compare the practice to the specific language and requirement of the regulation before determining that a deficiency exists. The critical factor is whether or not the evidence relates directly to the language and the requirement within the regulation. So again, be careful of that. Use those interpretive guidelines. They help us a lot, but be careful about it. Principle 6, citation of state or local code violations. This is the entity's failure to comply with a state, local laws, or regulations is not documented on the form CMS 2567 except when the federal regulation requires compliance with state or local laws. When the authority having jurisdiction for a particular state or local law has made a decision for noncompliance and has effectuated an adverse action that has been sustained through a hearing process, such as a removal of a license to operate, the form CMS 2567 should note that the entity no longer has a license. So sometimes this gets a little tricky, and it may be something that you would need to talk to your supervisor about. Cross-referencing. All right. Sometimes this can get a little tricky. Cross-referencing of requirements is an acceptable form of documentation on the Form 2567, only when it's applicable and provides additional strength to the linked citation. So in other words, you've got two situations that are so closely linked that you think it would provide strength. And so that's when we would cross-reference. It's most effective when the linked citations have a direct cause and effect relationship to the deficient practices described in both citations. But in all instances, a linked citation must contain sufficient evidence to demonstrate noncompliance for the reference regulation at the linked site. All right, for entities, Principle 8, that have a condition of participation. Condition of participation citation includes practice statements and findings to support a determination of noncompliance with a condition level requirement. They may be incorporated either by cross-references to those requirements that must be corrected in order for the entity to be found in compliance with the conditions of participation, or by narrative description of the individual findings. Right. So what we're going to do next is talk about some terminology. This is probably where I get a little bit repetitive, but we're going to go through some of these. All right, so the first one is going to be evidence. And evidence is an integral part of the citation that begins with a description of the deficient entity practice and identifies the relevant individual findings and facts that substantiate the failure of the entity to comply with the regulation. What led you to believe that you had a deficient practice? What's your evidence? And of course, in our long-term care world, your evidence is going to be probably all three of these: observations, interviews, and record reviews. It may not be all three, but most likely will be. It contains specific information about, and we've talked about this, the who, what, when, where, how of the events or the situations, what brought about this deficient practice. Observations. You know, these are just critical. It is just so critical that we go out there and look. Go see what is happening to those residents. How did this resident come in one way, and now we see this resident has totally been changed and something has gone wrong? And so what deficient practices have occurred that took this resident and made such a decline? What happened? And the observations are going to be critical. So we gather this information, you know, all the time, from the time you walk in the door, even before you even open a tablet. You're seeing things, you're hearing things, touch things, you smell things, you may even taste things during the survey. So that gives us a lot of information. Again, the questions come about. And the tablet helps us a lot in making sure we got dates and times. So make sure they're there. To the date and time of your observations. What did you see? Describe it. And make sure it's detailed enough, because you may not have that observation again. Let's say that your assigned female resident has facial hair, and you document this observation. You know, a lot of us have spent a lot of money about making sure about facial hair. But you think about this resident that has facial hair, and you think about what is the impact to that resident. So is this a deficient practice because this resident has facial hair? No. So we need to find out what the impact to the resident. If interviewable, you would ask the resident how they feel about having the facial hair. The resident may tell you, I've had it for a long time, doesn't bother me, and it hurts to remove it, so I just want it left alone. Or you could have an opposite situation where the resident says, I'm so embarrassed about it, I'm ashamed to leave my room. So is that an area that we need to investigate further? Absolutely. You know, so sometimes an initial observation may make you think one way, but but we have to further investigate to make sure that we understand the impact of what we're seeing and happening to a resident. Interviews. Strive to verify what residents tell you in interviews through observations and record reviews. So residents, we're all during the survey process, we're interviewing. And so pay attention to what the residents are saying and sometimes what they're not saying. But what are residents telling you? In the absence of other objective validation of information, information may also be confirmed or verified through multiple interview sources. So the resident says, there's just not enough staff here. They don't come fast enough when I ring my call bell. And that was one resident interview. Is that in itself a deficient practice? What do we need to do? Well, we need to what? We need to do some more observations and what? We need to ask other residents. So we may have a situation where we have many residents that are telling us the same thing. So sometimes it's a little difficult when you only have interviews, but if you have that, strive to find observations and record reviews, but also make sure that you've got additional interviews to back that up. All right, review of records and other documents. Through the review of recipients' records, surveyors determine the needs of residents and the extent to which the nursing home has addressed those needs. Of course, we're going to look at the record. We start out with a limited record review, but you're going to have to track back to the record. Again, most of our critical information is going to be through observations, but you're trying to corroborate those through the record. When using information obtained through the record review, identify the record that contained the information. That's very important. You know, just not say the medical record, but what about it? Where was it? Was it the MDS? Was it the care plan? Was it nurse's notes? What was it in the record? Obtain copies of records which show the deficient practice. Don't copy the entire record. Know why you're making a copy if you need to make a copy. Sometimes that has helped us a lot when we've had a copy, especially sometimes of an MDS. So use good judgment about what to copy. But the main thing is to try to corroborate information. All right, I asked you a question about what survey tools come to mind. And in my mind, I'm thinking of critical element pathways come to mind when I'm thinking about principles of documentation. And I pulled the one for pressure ulcer injury, critical element pathway, and if you want to, you can pull that too. And I just kind of gleaned some of the parts of it, and it gives us some great ideas about what to observe. So observe wound care and assess the wound. Observe as soon as possible. How are care plan interventions being implemented? So what are they doing? And you've got some care plan interventions. Do they do them? You know, observe if they did. Use of proper techniques when turning, repositioning, and transferring to avoid skin damage. And so these are all good parts that we can apply principle of documentation to. We look at the interview section for residents and for the resident representative or family interview. You know, asking the resident how the wound happened. How did it develop? When did it happen? Ask them, is it getting better? Is it getting worse? What is their description about it? Talking to staff about it, nursing assistants, nurses, the DON, maybe the attending physician or practitioner. What, when, and to whom do you report changes in skin condition when you see them? Tracking back to the record, review nursing notes or skin assessments. Did the resident have any unhealed pressure ulcers? And then we look at the critical element decisions. And this is where you're going to be making a choice about yes or no or NA. Did the facility ensure that a resident receives care consistent with professional standards of practice to prevent pressure ulcers? Does not develop pressure ulcers unless the resident's clinical condition demonstrates that they were unavoidable. Receives necessary treatment and services to promote the healing of a pressure ulcer, prevent an infection, and prevent new ulcers from developing. If no to any of these areas, cite F686. So we think about you've gone through this investigation. What does your evidence show? So be familiar with the questions as you're going about the investigation to make sure you can answer these. Look back at your observations and your interviews and record reviews. And if it's a compliance issue, do you have the evidence? And can you write that evidence in such a way that will show that there is a deficient practice? We've already talked about this, but the deficient practice, again, it is showing us the actions or the errors or what happened. What did this facility fail to do? It's usually that statement at the beginning of the evidence that sets out about the compliance with the regulation. It must be written in terms specific enough to allow a reasonably knowledgeable person to understand the aspects of the requirement not met. So this is a critical part of principles of documentation, being able to write that lead-in statement as to what did the facility fail to do. And if you're not sure, if you can't answer that question, what did they fail to do, sometimes we're at the wrong tag. And so that is a question you may want to ask yourself. All right. The statement must not repeat the regulation, but should state what the facility did that was wrong or failed to do. So it leads the reader then to look onward about the findings. So we've got a general statement of what the facility failed to do, and now we've got to do what? We've got to show it. The extent of the deficient practice is going to be the prevalence of the frequency of the practice. It'll be numbers, the numerical quantification of the practice. Identify the deficient cases, the number of deficient cases within the total number of relevant cases or universe. So the number of possible cases. Look back at your sample. Look back at the at what you've already looked at. Look at the number of cases. So if we're having trouble or having issues with pressure ulcers, and there's only one resident in the sample with pressure ulcers, and we found that there's a possible number of 7 residents, then we need to look at that. And we need to look at then the reference of, we only looked at one case. Is that enough? That's not enough. All right, and so that would be something that the team would need to consider. We'll look at facts. An event known to have actually happened, a truth known by an actual experience or observation. We look at finding, a generic term described to look at the discrete item of information observed or discovered during a survey about practices of an entity relative to the specific requirement. It needs to be in concise and logical sequence. And we look back at the questions. Who were the residents or the staff involved? What was the entity practice that was non-compliant? When, for how long did this problem occur? Include the number of observations and the duration of the observation. Include the specific dates or time period for the non-compliance. The findings also include documentation of verification or requests for additional information through interviews with facility staff. So think about, what documents do you need? Who do you need to interview? What questions need to be asked? What additional observations do you need? So this is all during the process. Try to make yourself go through these things so that you can determine if you have enough evidence, and it will help you. Looking at where the deficient practice occurred. Where was it in the building? Or did it happen in the room? Or did it happen in the dining room? How the deficiency was determined, and how the evidence relates to the requirement. The organization of findings should be organized in a chronological and logical order. So this just makes good common sense. So we begin with the most severe finding. So if we had a resident with let's say came in, was admitted with a stage 2 pressure ulcer, and because of the lack of good standards of practice and following the care plan, this pressure ulcer that was a stage 2 progressed to a stage 4. So we are now citing that, and so so we're saying this is immediate jeopardy. Is a severity level 4. Well, we would start with that resident in our looking at our evidence and our findings. So we start out with that, and then when we start out with that, then we would start in a chronological order of what happened. So the organization of the findings should clearly convey to the reader the sequential order of events that resulted in a citation. And it may be important to start out with the background. So for this resident, we would explain this resident was admitted on with a stage 2, maybe a description of that, and we were going to then start pointing out, based on our observations and interviews and record reviews, what happened, and then all of a sudden now it's now stage 4. And so what happened to create that situation? All right, so the outcome, result, or consequence of a practice. So it could be that development of an unavoidable pressure ulcer, it could be the outcome. Negative outcomes can include deterioration, failure to improve or maintain. And I want to talk about that for just a minute. So we think about failure to reach the highest practicable level of functioning. Think about a resident who was admitted with a potential to feed herself. However, the staff are feeding the resident. And you make those observations of the aides bringing the tray in, and let's say they set it up, and then they begin to feed the resident. So there's what? There's no opportunity for that resident to what? Begin to feed himself. And so we think about not being able to reach that highest practicable level of functioning. So think about it, the resident was receiving the proper nutrition. That resident hasn't lost weight. But that resident does not have the opportunity to reach their highest practical level of functioning by, or at least trying to feed himself. So although no negative outcome may be evident from the deficient practice, a failure to comply with the requirement is a deficiency. So think about why are residents, it's a little bit easier, like we saw the resident go from a stage 2 to a stage 4. So there was definite deterioration, there was definite decline. But what about that failure to improve or that failure to maintain? So think about that. Those are also concerns. The universe, the total number of individuals, records, observations, objects related to the entity practice or recipients at risk as a result of the deficient practice. Well, in our long-term care survey procedures, the universe is the number of residents investigated for each care area as noted on the sample finalization screen by care area option. So you need to check that. So during the survey process, there are going to be several documents, but need to look at the number of cases that we're looking at, the number that would give us an idea about the universe. So strive to look at that. Also, I was looking at this part of, in the long-term care survey process resources, editing and finalizing statements of deficient practice. And here's what it tells us. Record clear, adequate, and concise on-site documentation throughout the survey. Does that sound familiar? Documentation of findings that are clear, adequate, concise documentation of observations, interviews, and record reviews help surveyors make defensible compliance decisions. The documentation should clearly identify the deficient practice that led to the non-compliance. So what does CMS say? Keep principles of documentation in mind to help reduce the time needed to edit final citations for the 2567. So the thing is, if during the survey process you can apply principles of documentation as you're going about the survey process and going about survey task, then number one, it'll save us time, but number two, you'll be able to make those defensible compliance decisions. So that's why it's so important. So think about that as you're documenting, and think about as you're looking at evidence and you're writing down evidence. I know that time gets very short on a survey, but try to take the time to incorporate and write in such a way that it'll save us time. All right, ensure that the deficiency is right. We have said this, and so this is again just a recap about the deficient practice statement and then severity and scope. So we will continue to go ahead with that. and then making sure that the key components of the deficiency statement, the sources, what they failed to do, the extent, the outcome, and the identifiers. This leads us to an activity. So you have components of a deficient practice statement. So you have these, and so the purpose of this is to practice the 5 components of the deficient practice statement that we just went over. And our review, we're going to review a brief resident scenario on pages 14 through 17, and we're going to answer these questions. And you have a copy of the questions. So we're going to review, so I would like for you to pause the video and go ahead and review those scenarios, and then I want you to answer these questions based on the scenario. So go ahead and stop the video, and then we'll reconvene. All right, so now that you've done that, you looked at the scenario, let's look at the answers. What are the sources of information through which evidence was contained? All right, so then what are we looking at? Observation, interview, and record review. All right. The facility failed to do what? Reposition, provide ordered treatments, provide pressure relieving devices. What is the extent of the deficient practice, or the number of deficient cases relative to the number of such cases? We had 4 of 4 residents with pressure ulcers in a sample of 12. What sample residents were affected? Resident identifier 1, 6, 10, and 12. And what are the outcomes? 4 of 4 residents have facility-acquired pressure ulcers. 3 of 4 residents experience increase in severity or number of pressure ulcers. I hope you got those right. I'm sure you did. All right, based on information reviewed in the answers, I want you to try your hand at writing a deficient practice statement. This may give you a little bit more information. Mrs. Berry went from a stage 2 to a stage 4 facility-acquired pressure ulcer. Mrs. Goodman went from 1 stage 2 pressure ulcer to 2 stage 2 facility-acquired pressure ulcers. Mrs. O'Donnell went from a stage 2 to a stage 3 facility-acquired pressure ulcer. And Mrs. Whitaker developed a stage 2 pressure ulcer in the facility. So thinking about these, think about how you would write a deficient practice statement. I know you're not there. This is an armchair survey, but just try to write the words and see if you can kind of formulate that. So go ahead and pause the video and go ahead and try writing that deficient practice statement. All right, well, let's see what we've got. Here's an example. I'm not saying this is like perfect, but based on observation, interview, and record review, the facility failed to reposition, deliver ordered treatments, and provide pressure relieving devices for 4 of 4 residents, residents 1, 6, 10, and 12, with facility acquired pressure ulcers out of a sample of 12 residents. All right, and so then we would think about severity with these, and so I'm not going to have us do the severity and scope, but you can kind of think about the fact if you had a stage 2 go to a stage 4, probably we would be at immediate jeopardy for that one resident. So we may want to think about that if we were determining what the severity and scope is. All right, good job with that. All right, we think about relevant facts and findings because we also have to provide the noncompliance and give and describe that noncompliance, and we are looking at more substantiated by more than one source whenever possible, and are based on the facts and events that happen. So again, make sure you got the correct regulation. You may need to make more observations. You may have to interview more staff. So now we've got to describe the noncompliance with the regulation, not the interpretive guidelines. and how many sources do we have. And so we'd like to have as many. So right now what I want you to do is, just with the scenario that we just had for Mrs. Berry, and I want you to look at pages 14 through 17, and I want you to try to list, for sure for Mrs. Berry, if you're running short on time, for Mrs. Berry, think about the relevant facts and findings for F686 pressure ulcers and list those findings. So go ahead and pause the video and we'll come back and take a look at some of these findings. Alright, so let's look at Mrs. Berry, resident number 1. We have a brief description about Mrs. Berry. So we can see the information: the skin was intact, the diagnosis was CVA, the annual MDS reflected a risk for pressure ulcers, the care plan did not address skin condition until 3/15/11 when a stage 2 pressure ulcer was documented, with a need to change every 2 hours and keep the bed clean and dry and wrinkle free. So then we start with our observations. Alright, so then we made the observations, and you can see the observations that we made. The fact that we see her in the bed with a wet, soiled clothing, and we see that at several times. We see her on the left side in the bed, not repositioned, and that happened several times. And we see her in the bed on her back. Notice the specific times. We see a treatment observation on 6/7/11 at 9:45 by an LPN. And so we see that it was actually done correctly by the plan of care. Observation of the RN at 9:30 revealed a failure to apply debriding ointment ordered by the physician. So we start out with our observations. We see then that an LPN failed to wash hands before putting gloves on and placed the soiled dressing in the resident's waste can and placed the clean dressing on the overbed table that was soiled with food residue. We look at the record and we see then what happened for the stage 2 pressure ulcer, and we see the changes. A stage 3 noted and the size, stage 4 noted and the size, with tunneling, plus with green, bloody, foul-smelling odor. And the physician's order dated 4/1/11 indicated treatment orders to be done twice a day to the coccyx. Alright, if you did Mrs. O'Donnell, we see a brief description about her, and she had a post-diagnosis, post-CVA depression. Her skin was also okay, was intact. And we see then that she's sitting in the A Hall nurses station, and she doesn't have any kind of pressure relief cushion. And we see her then with urine odor detected, and we see that there's a saturated incontinence pad without a pressure relief cushion. The incontinence pad was partially off, revealing no dressing on a right buttock pressure ulcer. So we actually see the pressure ulcer. And then we see her being back in her room and assisted, and the CNAs remove the incontinence brief. And we see the CNA, I guess I should get, we ask about the dressing. I guess I should get the nurse to put a dressing on this. So then we see the CNA applying A&D ointment. We see the resident in the dining room, and we see the fact that she still doesn't have a cushion. Then we see her back at the nurses station. We see her then on 6/8/11, and we see her in the bathroom, and the two aides remove a feces-soiled, wet, incontinent brief. There's no dressing on the right buttock pressure ulcer. They do incontinence care. They apply the A&D ointment, and then she's assisted back to the wheelchair without any kind of pressure relieving cushion. We see that we talk to the resident, and and we also see on 6/7/11 at 9 the treatment nurse was interviewed about the treatment, and she said, she stated that the the treatments are not always carried out in her absence, so that would be something we would want to follow up on. But we see that the resident said it hurts. All right. We see some record review about the stage 2 on the quarterly MDS, documented a progression to a stage 3, and then the orders included the debridement agent and covering the area with dressing. So these would be some of the, based on a little scenario, these would be some of the relevant facts and findings that we would have for these two residents. All right, good job on that. I know that was a lot of work. All right, activity 5-3 is developing a deficient practice statement and supporting evidence. And I'll have to also clarify, we had originally planned for this to be, for these to be group activities, and obviously you're by yourself, so you're a team of one when you're doing these. So you may see in your instructions about a team, but you're a team of one today. All right, activity 5-3, developing a deficient practice statement and supporting evidence. And so I want you to look at an abbreviated case study for Mrs. Smith on pages 21 and 22, and also review page 23. And I want you to develop a deficient practice statement for F692, nutrition, hydration, status, maintenance. And if you have time, then develop some examples of supporting evidence. And we've got some questions that we're going to answer. So right now, pause your video and we will come back and look at these questions. All right, which is the best based on statement for Mrs. Smith's scenario? All right, if you pick number 1, that's correct. Observations, interviews, and record review. We have all 3. Our next question is, what was the facility failure in the Mrs. Smith scenario? Let's look at the options. All right, take a look at those. The correct response is 2. The facility failed to offer the required amount of liquids to prevent symptoms of dehydration. We tried when we were developing this to stay away from sufficient. And so we were trying to say offer the required amount. You know, sometimes when you're looking at record, you know, and you can also determine how much a person needs, but usually the dietitian has determined how much a person needs of fluid to prevent symptoms of dehydration. So that's what we felt was the main failure. What is the extent of the deficient practice for F692? Take a look at those. All right, if you pick 3, that's correct. 6 of 12 sample residents plus 2 additional residents observed who had concentrated urine in their catheter bags. This Newbern and her roommate. So this would be the extent. It wouldn't be 1. It wouldn't be 6 of 100. It wouldn't be 5 of 6. So it's 6 of 12 sample residents is the way we perceive that. All right. And I gave you a form that you can kind of see the big picture for other residents for dehydration. So what is the severity and scope of this deficient given the following information? Mrs. Smith plus 5 additional residents, 1, 4, 6, 10, 11. And actually it was 5 residents at severity level 3 and 1 resident at severity level 2. So think about then, what is the highest level of severity that we have? All right, so we have 5 residents at severity level 3. So severity level 3 is going to be what we're looking at. And we have what? We've got 5 residents, so that's going to be a pattern. So severity level 3 pattern would be what? It would be an H. All right, so let's take a look at your example of writing the deficient practice statement. And let's see what we've got. This is kind of a lengthy example. Yours may be just a little bit shorter. Based on observation, interview, and record review, the facility failed to address symptoms of dehydration, including scant concentrated urine output and laboratory indicators of dehydration, encourage fluids as ordered, develop or implement care plans to address dehydration, and offer the required amount of liquids, which resulted in symptoms of dehydration for 6 of 12 sample residents. RI number 1, 3, 4, 6, 10, and 11. All right. Let's take a look. So if you had time to add some supportive evidence, if you haven't had a chance to do that, go ahead and take a look at the evidence. So pause the video if you haven't had a chance to look at that, and let's look at some supportive evidence that we would take into consideration for this deficiency. All right, so what we had, and we have the dates and the time, observed in the bed, the breakfast tray at the bedside. The meal was untouched except for the liquids. She stated that she had just been too uncomfortable to eat much. Pale, disheveled, lips dry and cracked, catheter bag sitting on the floor, contained dark, concentrated urine. There was no water at the bedside, and the resident stated that the aides forgot again. On 6/7/11, at the time, the surveyor observed the resident in the bed, no water at the bedside, dry tongue, dry cracked lips. We observed the resident in the dining room playing bingo. The glass of tea was empty. She requested another glass from a nearby table, but nearby aide, stating that she was very dry. During an interview, when asked about the lack of fresh water in the room, the resident said the aides mean well, but they frequently don't have time to do luxury things like providing ice water in the room. Record review noted the MDS indicated dehydration as a care area assessment concern. There was no care plan to address the dehydration concern. So I hope that gave you a good idea about how to actually apply the principles, and I hope those exercises were helpful to you. Let's take a look at effective writing. So again, clear, be objective, strive to write in a way that the reader will understand, and follow rules of grammar and punctuation. When is the last time you sat in an English grammar class? I would say it's been a long time. It would be a long time for me. You may want to access this. It's a help, but there are a lot of programs out there to help us remember grammar and punctuation. Sometimes our computers will prompt us a little bit, but if you're having, if you just need a refresher, I think all of us probably do. And so think about that if that's something that you think you need. Make sure that we put facts in chronological order. It's helpful to keep sentences short and simple. So I've read some deficiencies that kind of when a sentence went on and on and on, semicolons, therefore, however's. So when we start adding that much, you lose the intent of that sentence and what you're trying to communicate. So take a look at that. Try to keep them shorter. Use active voice. So that is a good way to keep a sentence shorter. If you use, so instead of saying was observed, is the fact you're going to flip that and put that in the active voice. Making sure that we don't use abbreviations and initials and technical jargon. So if you do use an abbreviation, what do? You got to define it, or an initial, define it. Making sure that you're not going to write something so technical that somebody's not going to understand. Use plain language, write in layman's terms, and we want to write to inform, not to impress. Some more things, unnecessary words. Sometimes the more words written, you may think that you're really helping you drive that case home, but sometimes it'll create a lack of understanding. One time I was reading a deficiency, and it was several pages. And by the time I got to the end of it, I was going like, Now, what did they do wrong? Because the surveyor had tried to put so much in there to prove her case as to why this was a deficient practice, that there was so much in there that it lost sight of what was the actual real problem. And I've had an administrator call me before, and he said, Becky, I really understood in the exit what we did wrong, but when I got the deficiency, I just don't get it. And so that's what we're trying to do, is communicate. And so if sometimes the more words we use kind of will muddy the waters. Try to make sure that the words that we use, if we say it seems like, or it appears like, or did not always, so those are very vague. Don't be very careful about words that imply or state conclusions without having the facts to back that up. If you're going to quote something, make sure you have it accurately quoted. If you're not sure that it's an accurate quote, then paraphrase it. So if you put something in quotes, make sure that it's exactly right. We look at also in effective writing, avoid generalities such as was observed all day. So we've got to have those specific times. I can remember sometimes we said that somebody was observed and it went through the lunch hour. I think one of the administrators said, well, I know you didn't observe her during lunch because y'all weren't here. So make sure you've got that actually accurately documented when you made an observation. Include who was observed, when, where, and it's really good to have who else is present. So just think about where were you in the hallway, where were you during this observation. So make it measurable, descriptive, and objective. All right. Cite the appropriate reg. Correct date and time. Include the accurate or resident identifier. We've made mistakes in that. We all have, where we had the wrong identifier or we had the wrong resident. We had, instead of being in bed A, they were in bed B. So make sure you are checking that. Correct your typos. Spell check is great, but it may not catch everything. You may have actually typed a correctly spelled word, but it was the wrong word. So be careful about that. I love spell check, but sometimes it's not going to be foolproof. So look at that. In doing this presentation, I typed, just to tell you what word does it, and it's always done this, I think forever since I've typed a gazillion things. When I typed CNA, you know what it did. It changed it to can. So I had to go back and fix that a couple of times before it would go like, okay, I guess she means CNA. So be careful about that. All right, in our summary, I just want to say that deficiencies are always going to be critiqued. And I would say for surveyors, especially for new surveyors, try to accept the critique in a positive way and try to have the attitude, learn from mistakes. I would say supervisors and managers, strive to deliver the critique in a positive, helpful way and make it a teaching moment. All of us have made mistakes. I have read a gazillion deficiencies. I've written a gazillion deficiencies, and they're not perfect. And writing deficiencies is hard, and it's something that we get better as we practice. But remember, the goal is to be able to accurately communicate deficient practices to bring about correction. While in the facility, look back over your work. Is it complete? What do I need to do to make it stronger? Help each other. Work as a team. Have another team member read your deficiencies. I asked a friend of mine out in Texas, I said, okay, how did y'all write deficiencies? And she said, sometimes I'd get stuck and I'd say, Donna, help me get this word right, or help me get this sentence right. And we used to do that same thing. So help each other. Sometimes deficiencies will be deleted. But hopefully we'll learn from why that deficiency was deleted. But sometimes we have already discussed that situation with the facility, and hopefully they corrected it, even if we may have lost that tag. My main words for you is don't get discouraged. Look at the survey, it's a legal procedure. Apply these principles of documentation. Try to improve our writing skills and be effective. I wish all of you, each of you, a successful and fulfilling survey career. I hope you'll always have the heart to do your best to improve quality of care and life for our residents in nursing homes. And I hope this presentation was helpful. And thank you for your participation in learning more and refreshing your memory about principles of documentation. Thank you so much.